everybody, and welcome to another board game discussion video. This particular discussion video, I will say, has literally nothing to do with board games whatsoever. Instead, today's video is all about card games. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about collectible card games. That said, as always, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at my Facebook and my Twitter pages where I post new videos, contests, giveaways, new articles, all sorts of fun stuff, and it's a great way to stay in touch with me. In addition, please take a look at my brand new Patreon page where you can actually become a sponsor for my channel and have a big influence over what videos I release and get behind the scenes access and all sorts of other cool stuff. That said, we're going to move right along ahead and start talking about collectible card games. There are three major ones that I wanted to sort of discuss in the context of what I'll be talking about, which are Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Those are really the big ones that we normally hear about all across the country, all across the world, and we see tournaments and all this kind of thing. So essentially, I wanted to talk about three specific points for these types of games. The first one is their generalized impact on the gaming community as a whole. The second is sort of the idea of how most of them are constantly having new releases and updating and the general collectability of these games, because again, they are collectible card games or trading card games, whatever you want to call them. And last but not least, my own personal thoughts. So first and foremost, I'll talk a little bit about what brought this up. I've been talking with several people for quite a while who are big into trading card and collectible card games, and the fact is that the world of that group of game types is much bigger than I thought there was. And on top of that, there are a lot more collectible card games than I ever thought. That's why for today, I'm limiting it to those three that I mentioned earlier. But that said, certain games have their own thing. Like, I believe World of Warcraft has their own. I know that EVE Online has their own, even though it's much smaller. We see it with, we've got the living card games, which are sort of in between the card game, like the ones that I have on my shelf, compared to the collectible card games with things like Game of Thrones and Star Wars and all that kind of thing. So it's a huge world that I really have not talked about at all. So I wanted to do that today. First and foremost, talking about the impact on gaming. The fact is, collectible card games, particularly Magic the Gathering, really bolsters and holds up a lot of aspects of gaming. If you go to an FLGS, a friendly local game store, more often than not, they are primarily selling Magic cards and hosting Magic the Gathering tournaments. That's really how a lot of these places get money, is through sanctioned tournaments that are sort of not really sponsored by Wizards of the Coast, but essentially they're given the okay, they're sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast. And so people pay tournament fees, they have to buy booster packs, a lot of times the prizes are boosters, so as far as Wizards is concerned, it really doesn't cost them very much to have these tournaments sanctioned. But then we're talking about rules and all sorts of stuff, which I'll get into a little bit more on my second point. But the fact is, regardless of my personal opinion on these games, they are holding up a large portion of the gaming community, at least financially. Without them, most friendly local game stores really would not exist, because it's where a significant amount of money and foot traffic comes from. Because more often than not, game stores, they will buy and sell collectible cards, and that means that they'll get a lot of money from that. They'll get people in the door potentially buying new things, as well as increasing their own personal inventory, telling people about the tournaments, having them come in, all of that kind of stuff. Not to mention the tournaments themselves. We've got large-scale, local, regional, national, international, huge tournaments. Absolutely enormous, and essentially since like the mid-90s or so. At least that's as far as I know for it. So moving right along into the updates and the actual collectability for these games. The biggest thing is obviously they are collectible card games, and the way that they all function just inherently is you've got starter decks, you've got booster packs, you've got all these different ways of getting your new cards. And that's essentially what you see, is you've got specific sets of cards that are released every once in a while depending on the game itself, and you'll get a booster pack for that set, and typically you'll get a decent number of common cards, you'll get a few uncommons and one rare card in a single booster pack. That's typically the formula for how these work, with the idea being that the rare cards are more powerful both in the game and more collectible outside of the game. So one interesting thing, a little bit of history on this, is the way that Magic the Gathering has stayed so popular is that while yes, it is a collectible card game and there is a huge secondary market for these games and the cards themselves, the fact is that most players, when they buy these packs, when they buy these decks, they are primarily interested in actually playing the game. And that is a really key aspect that a lot of these other, especially smaller collectible card games, seem to miss. The fact is that you can have collectibles, you can have all these kinds of things, like take baseball cards as an example. Baseball cards, you don't really do anything with them. You literally put them in resin or card protectors, whatever you're doing with them, and maybe you display them or you just put them in a box somewhere or something like that. Like this, they don't give you any inherent value to yourself and to intellectualism and all that kind of stuff, whereas good collectible card games encourage you to actually use the cards. That's what they're there for. That's the idea behind them. And Magic the Gathering has done that splendidly, and that's why it has been around for literally decades. Same thing with Pokemon. Pokemon has been around for decades. I used to collect Pokemon cards. I was one of those guys. I also used to play the cards. I used to play it as a game. I would go to tournaments and do all that kind of stuff. I used to do that back in the day. And the thing is, as far as collectability, that's one of the biggest things when it comes to set releases, because there have been so many different editions, especially of Magic, where you've got the Unlimited Edition, the Alpha, and the Beta, and then you've got like all these new Planeswalkers, you've got a Comet, I think is how it's pronounced. It's like the latest one, and we see set releases like twice a year, somewhere along those lines. We are constantly seeing new cards being added to the sort of pool, and this affects how the game is impacting games and tournaments and all that kind of thing, because effectively what happens is as new sets get released, older sets stop being usable in tournaments. So people who are really serious about continuing to play the games, they have to buy the new cards and they have to build new decks. That said, the older cards start to become more valuable because gradually those are going to stop being printed, and as they stop being printed, they start to increase in secondary monetary value. So again, you've got that balance between I want to play with the cards because I can enter these tournaments, I can earn a lot of money potentially, there's a ridiculous amount of money involved, but then afterwards, if I keep the cards, then I'll be able to sell them as collectible items later because they're no longer being printed. Now, the extreme examples of those are in Magic the Gathering with the, I believe it's the Power 9, if I'm not mistaken, from the especially Alpha and Beta releases, where the one that I always remember is the Black Lotus. And we're talking about, if you've got a very, very good example of a card, you're talking about nearly $10,000 for a single card. That said, just getting a really good, solid, playable deck, depending on the tournament rules, I mean, potentially $900. Low-end decks will run about $200 or $300. Now, I can't really say much sitting in front of a giant shelf full of a whole bunch of different board games, but at the same time, collectible card games, that's essentially how they work. The better a card is, the more expensive it's going to be, but when you get a good solid deck that you can then use for, I think it's 6 months to a year, that cards are still good, then it's awesome and it's amazing, and you paid this money and you can potentially win a lot more. But that's really what it's about. It comes down to you build a good deck, you have a tremendous amount of strategy involved with building the deck and getting your synergies right between your cards and all of these kinds of things. And it's the same with Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. Now, I mentioned earlier I used to collect Pokemon cards, and the fact is, especially with new Pokemon games continuously being released, we also see new cards being released as well to coincide coincide with the new games. Yu-Gi-Oh! Honestly, I'm not nearly as familiar with as the other two. I think they've had a few releases, but very, very few, because the anime isn't making new episodes, so there's not a whole lot else going on with it, but people still play it. It is still actively done, and I believe that the cards are still being made. So that's really the big thing, though, is that I don't understand how players can keep up with this. I imagine that it's something like the way that I think of board games, people think of these collectible card games. It's like something new comes out and it's like, boom, yes, need it, got it, done. That kind of thing. And I feel that way about some board games, like scientifically themed board games. I'm like, yes, boom, I need that one, I got it, yay, happy. And I have a feeling that it's the same type of idea. So with that going right into my thoughts, I've already said a few of them. The fact is that collectible card games just make my brain hurt. There are so many different sets, so many different interactions with the cards. It's just mind-boggling, completely and utterly mind-boggling for me personally. Again, it's probably because I'm not in the idea. And it's the same thing with like an MMORPG, where whether it's World of Warcraft or EVE Online or WildStar, all three of which I have played at one time or another, if you're not really superbly into the game, then you're not going to be able to understand it on any real level, much less be able to do something in a tournament. Not that I ever would try, but that's the biggest thing for me, is that I constantly see these updates, I get emails from Cool Stuff and all this kind of thing telling me, hey, we've got this new set release for Magic, and we're going to have this release party and all this kind of stuff. And I see the same thing at my friendly local game store where they've got the new posters for Magic and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, how can people keep up with this? And for me, I think it's, like I mentioned earlier, just a different mindset, switching from, in my case, board games and this kind of thing into the collectible card games. If I put as much effort into CCGs as I do into board games, I would probably feel much better about it and be much more confident in what I'm saying and how the decks are built and where I can get the cards and how to build a deck and all that kind of stuff. Because it has literally been decades since I played Magic, and it's been probably about 15 years or so since I was really into Pokemon cards. So much has changed, it's absolutely ridiculous. I still remember the basic mechanics, but if you showed me the latest set, the newest card types, like Planeswalkers, for example, or a new card type that everybody's freaking out about, and I'm just like, I have no idea. I really don't know. And like Ultra Mega Super Rare or something like that. Now, I do apologize. I don't mean to insult anybody by saying this. I just honestly don't know the terms. I'm not trying to make fun of anything in any way. It's just I really don't get it. And it just makes my brain hurt seeing people buy thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of these cards at a time. I'm just like, what? But then I look at my own game collection and I'm like, yeah, if I was of a different mindset, I could totally see it. But that said, I have nothing but the utmost respect for people who play and collect CCGs or TCGs, whatever you want to call them. Because the fact is, the games themselves are absolutely wonderfully strategic. And the best analogies that I can give are deck building games. So things like Legendary and Dominion and those kinds of things. So I've got Legendary, for example, right here, and Dominion all below it. I even just got Clank not too long ago. And it's the same type of thing where you're looking at card synergies, you're trying to figure out how can these build off of one another, how can I make this better and better and better upon itself. And you're doing the same thing in Magic the Gathering, but you have so many more options. It's absolutely insane, and that's part of why Wizards of the Coast implemented this sort of rotation system, where after a certain amount of time you can't use specific sets in the really major tournaments because you essentially have unintended consequences, like when you mix drugs together, they might interact in some way that you don't expect. Kind of the same thing with the cards, because there are literally so many different ones. That said, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different tournament rules. You can have things where proxy cards are potentially allowed. In other words, it's not actually that card, It's just a different card that says this is actually a Black Lotus or whatever. Or you use cards that are just printed versions of the same thing. Those are not sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast, I will mention that. However, it is something that friendly local game stores might run, just so you can test out a deck, for example, and things of that nature. And I just think that the community aspect for these games is incredible. On par, if anything, it's greater than the community value for board games, honestly. And I say that as a person who plays a lot of board games, and not only that, but makes videos about board games. The camaraderie and the community aspect for collectible card games is even bigger, better, stronger, faster. Because that's what they all are about. They're all trying to make the best decks. They're all trying to beat the best decks and figure out all these wonderful strategies. And it is truly incredible. And again, I have nothing but the utmost respect for those people, but by God, it makes my brain hurt so much. But with all that said, that's plenty of rambling for me. This one especially, again, I am completely and utterly unaware of the vast majority of aspects for collectible card games. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about them. So please put any and all of your thoughts into the comments below. You guys know that I love to hear from you. As I said earlier, make sure that you check out my Facebook and my Twitter pages, as well as my Patreon if you're interested in becoming a sponsor for my channel. But with that, thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you next time.